welcome to Talking Till Dawn. I'm Martin, and I'm joined by the nicest man south of the River Clyde, Mr. Michael Whitehouse.
That is quite a claim, sir, but I'll take it. I'll take it all day, every day.
How are you?
I am fine.
Good.
I'm fine. Weight loss is stalled, everybody.
Really?
Not going to lie. It's sort of stalled for the last week and a half. Fell off the wagon a little bit.
As long as you're not going backwards.
Not well. I've put a pound on.
Oh,
so,
a pound's nothing, man.
Yeah.
You can get rid of that going to the toilet.
Yeah. Jesus. Yeah, so it's no big deal. Tomorrow, back on it. It's fine. We'll get there.
You're doing great. I'm pointing
Thank
a supportive elbow in the direction of Uddingston.
And I know you are so technically correct that you will actually be doing it in the direction of Uddingston.
I don't actually know really where Uddingston is, but I'm pointing out the window.
Don't
Uddingston's out the window somewhere.
Yeah, fucking is, aye.
Here's a question for you, right? How would you like to be able to eat almost anything with no limit on the amount or the calorific value and never put on any weight?
I would love that.
It does sound great, I'm not going to lie. And in fact, in defiance of everything we know about dietetics and physiology, there do seem to have been at least a few humans in history for whom this was in fact the case. They could, and did, eat huge, prodigious amounts of food and other materials without gaining. However, if the monkey's paw taught us anything, Mike, it's if something sounds like an amazing gift, there's probably a horrific, life-ruining catch.
Absolutely.
And oh boy, was there a catch. Before we get into this episode, I will give a quick content warning here. This episode will touch on topics kind of relating to eating disorders. Some points will allude to animal cruelty, unfortunately, and we will touch upon an event that potentially involved the death of a child. So if any of those issues are likely to be unduly upsetting to you, you may wish to give this episode a skip. That out of the way.
Here's the content warning about all the terrible things we're about to talk about. Right, everyone, that's out the way now. Let's get stuck in, shall we?
So, sometime in the year 1772, a child was born to a family of farm-working peasants near the city of Lyon in France. History records this boy's name as Tarrare. This was likely not his birth name. This was probably a nickname given to him much later on when he would become a figure of fame or of infamy. According to author Jan Bondison, Tarrare likely derives from the onomatopoeic phrase bonbon Tarrare, which was a common expression in France at the time, referring to the sound made by fireworks, gunfire, and explosives, and was likely in reference to the boy's terrible flatulence.
Oh, dear Lord. I was going to say it sounds like a Eurovision Song Contest group.
I would love it.
Bon Tarrare with, whoops, there goes my knickers.
But it's funny because, as we'll see, his flatulence is probably one of his least notable physical characteristics. Today we know him only as this because, unfortunately, his given name is now lost to time. And in fact, very little is recorded about this man's early life. What we do know is that as a boy, he developed a large appetite. An extremely large, almost impossibly large appetite. One that unfortunately made him an unsupportable drain on the scant resources of his family and community. By his mid-teens, Tarrare was eating up to a quarter of beef in a single day. Now, I'm not much of a carnivore, so I had to look this up to check that it really was what I thought it was.
Is that a quarter of a cow?
Yep.
Oh my God.
A quarter of all the edible butchered parts of a cow. Or approximately Tarrare's own body weight in meat in a single day. Perhaps not every day, but he was noted to have achieved that at some point. That sounds incredibly far-fetched, and it's hard to visualise someone putting away that much food. Usually I'd be quite sceptical of that claim, especially since Tarrare himself is probably the source for this claim. He wasn't being studied by doctors or anything at this point, and his family are unlikely to have been involved at the time these statements were being recorded, for reasons that will be clear soon enough. But much of what we hear about his later escapades is more reliably recorded, and in the light of those, I actually have very little doubt about the truth of that claim. Now, how can a human being possibly eat their entire weight in a single day? Well, for one thing, Tarrare's body weight for most of his adult life was never more than about 7 stone, roughly 100 pounds in your favoured measurement, Mike, about 45.5 kilograms. He was small in stature and seemed to carry very, very little body fat in spite of his diet. And he never really seemed to put on weight. Obviously, the mass of whatever he'd packed into his colon that day would push the scales up while it was sitting inside him before it made its dramatic exit. But his underlying baseline weight seemed to be extremely stable. When Tarrare gorged himself on whatever he could get hold of, his abdomen would stretch and expand around the huge bolus of food he had consumed so that his stomach looked like that of a heavily pregnant woman, a full-on food baby, food quadruplets. So Tarrare's family couldn't afford to keep him in quarter cows anymore, and they kicked him out, aged 17. It's 1789, the French Revolution is just kicking off, and young Tarrare is homeless and wandering from town to town, begging, stealing, foraging in sewers and the refuse tips behind slaughterhouses, eating God knows what to satisfy his never-ending hunger.
Moving from town to town, eating towns. I'm sorry, this sounds absolutely nightmarish, and I've got nothing but sympathy for the man.
He didn't have a good time. A good time.
It's awful. It's one of those unbelievable real-life stories that seems so preposterous that you can't help but kind of laugh at it, at the surreal nature of it. But
we're just scratching the surface.
Oh, Jesus. All right, continue.
Well, you're right. I mean, not only was this poor guy cursed with this strange, furious hunger that he now had to somehow feed without employment, without a roof over his head, not only does he find himself in this situation in the midst of the most dramatic and bloody political upheaval of 18th century Europe, and coming right off the back of a tyrannical regime as well, so there's obviously no social safety net to speak of in France at this time. Tarrare was further disadvantaged by a number of strange, unpleasant physical characteristics that probably wouldn't have helped to endear him to any potential employers or good Samaritans. Tarrare stank to high heaven. That's something every source agrees on, and for an 18th century peasant, I think that's really saying something. You know, I'm sure we've all had encounters, maybe being stuck on a bus next to some unfortunate soul with a medical condition that causes them to have a certain bouquet, or just some dirty bastard who doesn't shower. Tarrare was in another league entirely. Not to jump too far ahead here, but Dr. Pierre-Francois Percy, who would later examine him, is quoted in the London Medical and Physical Journal, volume 42, as saying he often stank to such a degree that he could not be endured within the distance of 20 paces. Visually as well, Tarrare was quite a striking individual. He had an unusually large mouth, with lips so thin they were almost absent. He could open his jaws to a distance of 4 inches, which is about double the average. In some places, his skin appeared to hang loosely from his slight frame, including his abdomen, which is perhaps to be expected because, as I said, when he would gorge himself, his stomach and gut would swell up massively with all the food. He had loose skin also around his chin and his cheeks, which gave him the appearance of having like the heavy wrinkled jowls of a middle-aged or elderly man, but from a young age. Again, it wasn't fat, it was just skin. The skin around his waist was so slack that he could easily stretch it completely around his back and around to the front again. Some of these are features that you might expect to see in someone who has been very, very heavy and then quickly lost a huge amount of weight. But again, Tarrare's weight, in adulthood anyway, always seemed to hover somewhere around 100 pounds, 7 stone 2 or 45 kilos, not including whatever was sitting in his digestive tract, because it seems he could almost double that right after eating. I don't want to get into the theories on the underlying cause of Tarrare's condition just yet, because we've only just started to scratch the surface of the strange and macabre things the guy did and the tragic circumstances of his life. But might this combination of unusual anatomical features and extreme behaviour hint that there was some kind of syndromic reason for the way he was? Did he have a syndrome of some kind? But that's something we'll come back to. So all of this compounded to make Tarrare something of an outcast. The combination of his poverty, homelessness, his compulsion to constantly eat inhuman volumes of whatever he could get his chops around, his unprepossessing appearance, his odd demeanour, and his offensive smell, none of which he seems to have had any real control over, probably made it next to impossible for him to settle down into any kind of stable existence at that time in history. Eventually, though, he did meet a group of people willing to take him under their wing. By the beginning of the 1790s, Tarrare was living on the streets of Paris, and here he fell in with an itinerant company of thieves, hucksters, prostitutes, street performers, and charlatans. Perhaps not the most salubrious company to find yourself in, but what other options did Tarrare have? He's no use as a labourer of any kind if he has to keep stopping to eat. He habitually steals food. He absolutely reeks. The only people willing to take him in weren't doing so in spite of these issues, but because of them, because they saw a utility in them. It seems Tarrare came onto the radar of this particular band of ne'er-do-wells when he was noticed scavenging in sewers and rubbish dumps and eating things that would make a billy goat turn green. And naturally, they decided this would make a great sideshow. Now, there's a couple of different ways to characterize this arrangement. There's the life-affirming Hollywood version, where these are all just the soulful, creative rejects of a cruel society, you know, wandering souls who just don't fit in, finding solace and meaning with one another on the street. You know, there's an old guy with a cigar going, "Say, this kid's got something. Boy, I'm gonna make you a star. All the horses ring pieces you can eat."
Wait a minute, is this the greatest showman we're talking about? That's what it sounds like.
Possibly closer to the truth, you have the bleak reality where this perhaps strays into some quite dark exploitation, essentially. Maybe there was a bit of both worlds there. I don't doubt that he might have been happy to be finally earning some money, to be involved in something, to have, if not friends, some sense of community. But at the same time, some of the things they had him do were quite horrendous. He does seem to have done them willingly, sure, but again, what choice did he have? They put him on the street and had a hype man rustle up a crowd to watch as he ate things. That was it. That was his act. Like an 18th century mukbang, basically. And they would dare the audience to try and satisfy his hunger. People would bring him things like, "I bet you can't polish this off." Things like entire panniers of apples, wheelbarrows of rancid offal, huge piles of wine corks. This is France after all. Stones, as in rocks collected from the ground.
Oh man.
Large snakes, live, bones and all. Snakes were his favourite, apparently. Live eels, which he consumed whole, like a sword swallower. He crushed the head with his teeth to kill it, and then would just open his jaws wide and slurp the whole thing down into his belly. Like you're talking something almost a metre long.
Yeah.
He would eat flints, lizards, puppies, and live cats. Yeah, I have to watch what I say because my wee cat's sitting here and she just looked up at me when she heard the word cat.
Did I know you had a cat?
Yeah, she's appeared a few times on the podcast. She's made her appearance a few times.
I'm just, my brain's gone, everyone.
But yeah, I mean, it's so staggeringly cruel to eat live domestic animals or live any animals.
Yeah. So this is an early version of I'm a Celebrity.
Yeah, kind of. I guess so, yeah. He's not competing for anything, although we'll come to the purpose of this in just a minute. But in terms of the level of cruelty to animals involved in his acts, you know, the past is a strange country. This sort of thing, sadly, wasn't that uncommon at the time. people's attitudes to animals in Europe pre-19th century would strike us today as completely sadistic and psychopathic. Bear baiting, for example, was still a common entertainment just over the channel in Britain until around this time. It fell out of fashion in the 19th century, but occasional events continued to be held right up until it was banned by the Cruelty to Animals Act in 1835. If you go back to England around the time of Shakespeare, around the turn of the 17th century, the theatres and the bear gardens were like the two main forms of entertainment venue that existed. So you might have noticed that a lot of Shakespeare's plays are very bloodthirsty and gruesome, like Hamlet and Macbeth are pretty bloody. Titus Andronicus is an out-and-out gore fest. And part of the reason for this was that Shakespeare's plays were competing for shock value with nearby arenas where punters, instead of watching a fictional play, could pay to see real live animals goaded into tearing each other apart, to the cheers of an excited audience. Bears would be released into a pit with trained attack dogs. Monkeys were tied to donkeys and had hounds set upon them. When the owners of these venues had killed all the expensive imported animals, they then resorted to torturing cattle. Samuel Pepys wrote in his famous diary in 1666, "After dinner with my wife and Mercer to the bear garden, where I had not been, I think, of many years, and saw some good sport of the bulls tossing of the dogs, one into the very boxes." So dogs smashed into the audience, essentially. But it is a very rude and nasty pleasure. So even cultured people, with only mild reservations, were seduced by these blood sports. It was seen as just a bit of a guilty pleasure for him, you know, like going to a Man-O-War show or something. It's strange because when you look back into history like this, sometimes there are moments where some detail causes what feels like a moment of connection with the past, like a glimpse into the inner workings of a family unit or an insight into someone's emotional inner world that makes you feel like people have really always been the way they are, that human nature has changed so little. And you're able to feel almost a kinship with people across centuries and millennia, sometimes. But then you come upon things like this that have completely the opposite effect, and sometimes you think that these people were like another species entirely.
Yeah.
In terms of their attitudes, in terms of how they viewed things. Of course, by the same token, I'm sure there are things we do today or tolerate today that in 100 years people will look back on as barbarism if we haven't wiped ourselves out.
Let me get my soapbox about that for a second, Martin. I think that sort of judgmental process of judging previous generations has sped up exponentially, and now it's, within 20 years, maybe less, the previous generation is judged for doing things that the current generation doesn't like or doesn't appreciate. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm all for people trying to be noble and say, well, here's the mistakes of the past, let's fix these. I'm all for that. But I think you should also have some humility and understanding that, like you said, there'll be things that you're doing right now that you think are completely acceptable because of the norms that you've been living around and assimilating into yourself, into your own psychology, that maybe even just 10 years from now, 20 years from now, people are going to be saying that was hugely problematic.
Well, funnily enough, there is kind of a precedent to this. I mentioned there the Cruelty to Animals Act 1835. That kind of came in seemingly just kind of not out of nowhere, but there seems to have been a time period round about 1800, 1810 onwards where for some reason attitudes to animals, at least to domestic animals and, well, even just in general, seemed to go through a bit of a revolution. Within the space of maybe 10 or 20 years, there seems to have been a sort of touching of the conscience. I don't really know enough about it to go into all the social reasons behind that and how it spread, but that is an example of something that in very short space of time, they went from having bear pits and having dog fights, and I'm sure those kind of things still did go on in less metropolitan areas, but within a very short time, at least the sort of quote-unquote metropolitan elite had suddenly turned against this. And I don't know all the details, but again, that obviously has similarities with certain things today.
It's going to be geographically based in terms of the culture of that location as well, because I mean, you have the dog festival, the dog eating festival still goes on now.
Oh yeah, we're talking about Europe. We're talking about Western Europe.
Yeah, but But even then, I mean, and I have to say, I eat meat, so I'm part of the problem. But there are people who there's really no difference between a dog and a pig, you know, in terms of. Please don't take that quote and put my picture on a t-shirt. There's really no difference between a dog and a pig. What I mean is, ethically, there's no difference to eating a dog and eating a pig. It's just that we have this special relationship with dogs, and so we think that how could you do that? And it's just the same with, you know, there's some European countries where they eat horses, and in the UK that's a taboo thing. It's like, why would you eat a horse, you know? And people's ideas of what's acceptable, they don't just shift over time, but they also shift over location, and it's difficult sometimes to actually get a good grounding of what's ethically correct and what's ethically incorrect. I think probably smashing dogs into a crowd, I think we can all safely say that's wrong, and it's horrible. I'm just saying that it is interesting how people's attitudes vary in that way. And yeah, I wish human beings were better.
Yeah, it is a bit of a can of worms. We probably could talk about it all night, but several sources state or imply that the group Tarrare worked for or with or was a part of would use him and his feats of gluttony and animal cruelty to so shock and stun onlookers that they could send pickpockets into the audience who would then work with almost complete impunity because everyone's attention would be glued to Tarrare. After a while, he and his act were promoted from street crime distraction to become the warm-up act for a quack patent medicine salesman, so think like Grandpa Simpson's tonic. But Mike, it doesn't strike me as the best advert for something claiming to promote health. A sickly looking youth with sagging skin and a bad smell eating cute animals.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like the optimal marketing strategy.
No.
I don't know if maybe the routine involved Tarrare pretending to be cured by the medicine at the end, or whether they were claiming it had given him his appetite. You know, our tonic will restore your passion and appetites, but be careful, this man accidentally drank a whole bottle. Maybe it's something like that.
Like the people who get paid, you know, people that are like health enthusiasts who are super fit and they get paid to just put on a lot of weight, and then they do the before and after, and then they lose it all
awful.
really, really quickly because they're already health experts.
Really fit, or they just take the after photo first.
Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah, it's bullshit. Predatory bullshit.
Yeah, nasty. So yeah, I don't know how they sold that, or if it was just a case of Tarrare gobbling snakes and puppies for 10 minutes and then, well, we've got your attention. Tarrare's body seems to have had a fantastic capacity for enduring things that would severely injure or kill an ordinary person. But it wasn't completely impervious to being overwhelmed by the extremities of the things he put it through. At one of his shows, he finally managed to swallow something that lodged in his intestine and caused a blockage. I haven't been able to find out precisely what that thing was, but considering everything else he ate without any issues, I can only assume it must have been like a bowling ball or something.
Concrete mix.
He collapsed and was taken to the Hotel Dieu hospital, where he was treated with heavy-duty laxatives, which, after some exertion no doubt, succeeded in dislodging the obstruction. Bomb Tarrare, Michael. He then offered to put on a show for the doctors as a way of thanking them for saving his life, and they eagerly took him up on that. As the finale to his act, the showman borrowed the watch of a surgeon called Monsieur Giraud and announced he would swallow the expensive Swiss timepiece, no doubt hoping for a "get the watch back to you in a couple of days, bye," out the door, you know. The surgeon quipped back that if Tarrare didn't return the watch, he would have to cut him open to retrieve it. And that is the only occasion I can find where Tarrare actually backed out of eating something. Now, the French Revolution was in progress at this point, as we've said, but up till now it seems to have mostly been just background detail in the lives of the kind of underclass to which Tarrare belonged. That was about to change. The French Revolution was a much more gradual affair than I always sort of tacitly assumed. I have to admit, like, French history in general isn't something I'm particularly au fait with.
Did it not take place over like a decade or something?
Yeah, that didn't really click with me. And I don't know if it's just an artifact of how this period in history was taught to me in the school classroom, But before digging into this, the image I always had of the revolution was something that happened suddenly and was over in the space of maybe a year or two, like the storming of the Bastille and all of that. Maybe that's just me, maybe it's completely redundant me mentioning this, but it was actually a decade-long process, as you say. It ran from 1789 to 1799, and in April of 1792, a couple of years into what we would now call the revolution, King Louis XVI is still nominally in power, albeit a neutered form of power, in name only, really. He's been forced to end the absolute monarchy of France, but for a short period he remained as head of a constitutional monarchy, which was really run by a legislative assembly. This was a kind of stepping stone towards the eventual Republic of France. It was during the short existence of this constitutional monarchy in 1791 that the War of the First Coalition broke out, the first of the French Revolutionary Wars. There's a bunch of geopolitical reasons behind this conflict. I don't want to get sidetracked onto that. I don't even claim to fully understand it all myself, but suffice to say, most other European powers were alarmed at what they saw happening in France, and several of these nations fancied an excuse to potentially win a slice of France on the battlefield. So the Constitutional Kingdom of France, later the French Republic, found themselves engaged on various fronts at varying levels of intensity against a loosely aligned coalition of Dutch, British, Spanish, Prussian, and Austrian armies, among others. And in 1792, a few months into this conflict, the French army got its hungriest recruit. It's not clear whether Tarrare was drafted into the army, conscripted, whether he was strong-armed into it maybe to avoid some kind of criminal charges, or whether he signed up willingly. But one way or the other, this man became a soldier. Something tells me if this was today, Tarrare would not have passed the medical examination.
He sounds like a weapon of mass destruction.
Yeah, weapon of mass consumption. Just shows how desperate they were for troops though. Like, if they let Tarrare sign up with his issues and needs, I think they were probably accepting almost anyone. It doesn't take a genius to see that Tarrare and the army are not going to make a very successful combination. In fact, it almost killed him.
He's eating his boots again. He's eating his own boots again. Tarrare, we keep running out of boots.
It almost killed him, but not in the way that joining the army in wartime usually kills new recruits. In fact, I don't believe Tarrare ever saw any frontline action at all. But nevertheless, it's safe to say, Tarrare was put through his own kind of personal hell. The total daily ration for a French soldier, assuming no supply issues, which there undoubtedly were at times, would have been something along the lines of this: 1/2 kilogram of bread, 200 grams of meat, 30 grams of rice or 60 grams of peas, just over a litre of wine, 120 millilitres of brandy and some vinegar. Those numbers were from a few years later, in fact, during the Napoleonic Wars, but it was all I could find. I think at this time it may actually have been substantially less than that. It's a long way from a quarter of a cow. Tarrare very, very quickly began wasting away. In sheer desperation, he would often be found doing the chores of other soldiers, cleaning, scrubbing, digging ditches, shoveling shit, doing all the duties no one else wanted to touch, just to earn scraps of the other men's rations. But it wasn't even close to enough to power the hungry engine that was Tarrare's body. So
he was actually starving then, so it was like it wasn't just his appetite, it was like his body actually acquired the calories.
It appears from this anyway that his body was actually using what he was giving it and needed it to some extent. He could slave from dawn till dusk and still not earn enough calories to keep him going. And to be fair, he's probably also burning quite a lot of calories in trying to earn the food and doing the work.
Yeah.
He would also be found once again scavenging in gutters and middens and dung heaps for food waste and giblets and discarded fat. I think that's what you call a double dragon dinner, you know, kicking open waste bins to find old bits of chicken.
Nice. I'm enjoying that reference.
His superiors, to their credit, did eventually recognise that there was something very, very wrong with this strange little recruit buzzing around with his mop and bucket, raking through the rubbish piles. They could tell there was something medical going on that was beyond his control. To help him, they upped his rations and tried to put a stop to his duties for Scran scheme, but not surprisingly, it still wasn't enough for Tarrare. And before long, he ended up hospitalised with exhaustion. In the military infirmary at Sault-Sauron in northeastern France, doctors placed Tarrare on a quadruple ration diet to try and rebuild his strength. Even under bed rest and quadruple rations, Tarrare could be found hunting ravenously for scraps in garbage bins, and he was even caught in the apothecary room, having broken in, eating wound dressings and poultices.
Oh, man. Tarrare, that's a new low, mate. Poor Tarrare. You wonder as well if it's like a perfect storm of biological processes that are going on. The mechanism that would normally create revulsion at certain foods, certain objects, it's just not there either. There's the hunger, there's the fact his body's using the calories, and then there's a complete lack of revulsion in eating things that normally we wouldn't want to touch.
Yeah, it's hard to tell if that lack of revulsion is biological or if it's just something he has had to learn to have in order to achieve the amount of calories that he takes. You might be right. So yeah, Tarrare was eating poultices. Now, a poultice at this time would have been a mix of plant matter, medicinal ingredients, and clay to be caked over like a cyst or an infected limb. It isn't food.
No, that's definitely not food. Now, I may be a greedy guts, but I know, man, that's not food.
No. But it's clear from the fact that he was hospitalised with exhaustion. As you say, this wasn't all, or it wasn't entirely in his head. His body was demanding a pretty much unlimited amount of food, and he was somehow using it. And the compulsion to satisfy that demand was so strong that he would resort to eating non-foodstuffs, and in great quantities. The army medics quickly recognised this and became fascinated with the case of Tarrare. A Dr. Courville, surgeon to the 9th Hussar Regiment, and Dr. Pierre-Francois Percy, the chief surgeon at the Sault-Sauron Hospital, had him kept back as an inpatient in order that they could run a series of experiments on him. Nominally, these experiments had the goal of uncovering just what was wrong with Tarrare, but reading the actual lists of things they did, it comes across a lot more like, I wonder what would happen if we gave him this. I wonder what would happen if we made a car out of meat and just drove it into his mouth.
I think in the 1700s, science was in its infancy, and there was a lot of let's just see what happens.
Yeah, and like typically, Tarrare's compulsion to eat was so overpowering that orderlies in the hospital had to physically restrain him in the presence of food. So I presume this means like if they're handing out meals on the ward, they have to tie him to the bed to keep him from like sneaking up and devouring the whole trolley. However, one day a meal had been prepared for a team of 15 German labourers who had been working in the hospital grounds. Tarrare, of course, got wind of this banquet and was seen by hospital staff casually orbiting that shit with less than honourable intentions. Prince Andrew on a visit to St. Trinian's, The porters had their hands full keeping him away. Though, of course, the fact he stank for miles did give them a bit of a built-in early warning system. But either the labourers didn't show up that day, or maybe they did something to piss off Dr. Courville, or maybe the good doctor just didn't give a fuck about the labourers, because when he noticed Tarrare creeping around near the meal, he ordered instead that he be allowed to approach the table unobstructed, while he, Dr. Courville, took notes on what went down. The meal consisted of 2 immense meat pies, 2 gallons of milk, 2 gallons of sour milk, and several plates piled high with grease and salt. This is a meal for 15, remember. These are not free Bentos pies. They're each intended to be cut up and fed to like 7 or 8 burly workmen as a main meal, like they're big comedy-sized Desperate Dan's cow pie.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. I know them. Desperate Dan's pie with the cow
horn sticking out, yeah. So, Tarrare is slight, right? He's somewhere around 5'3". He's skinny. He's low muscle mass. Probably quite underweight. This was a meal for 15 heavy-duty workmen. Tarrare annihilated every crumb and every drop of what was on that table. Then he fell asleep, like a satisfied dog. Curville remarked in his notes that Tarrare's normally loose belly skin had inflated and become distended and taut like a vast balloon. Curville and Percy made detailed observations and descriptions of Tarrare, and it's from these records that most of what we know about him originates. In his book, The Two-Headed Boy and Other Medical Marvels, Dr. Jan Bonderson, who in fact I've met, Michael, he was talking at a conference I went to in 2007 called Myths and Monsters at the Newcastle Centre for Life. I bought one of his books from him and had a wee chat about Fiji mermaids, you know, the little taxidermy monkey fish things.
Yeah.
Swedish medical doctor. He's a genuinely nice guy. He looks a little bit like a World War I fighter pilot. Anyway, Bonderson explained in his book, Professor Percy wrote that the methods utilised by, quote, this filthy glutton to make sure his rations last were too disgusting to be described in detail. All creatures great and small were in constant danger from his ravenous jaws. The dogs and cats fled in terror at his aspect, like if they had anticipated the kind of fate he was preparing for them. The following is a quotation from the London Medical and Physical Journal, which translates to English their description of Tarrare from Dr. Percy's original French journal article, Memoire sur la polyphagie. Tarrare was of a middle-sized stature. His habit of body was weak and slender. He was not of a ferocious spirit. His look was timid. The little hair he had preserved, though very young, was very fair and extremely fine. His cheeks were sallow and furrowed by long and deep wrinkles. On distending them, he could hold in them as many as 12 eggs or apples. Just to cut in, there are a few facts about his appearance where it's unclear whether they are a result of whatever underlying condition or syndrome Tarrare had, or whether they're the result of damage caused by the years of abuse his body's been through. It may well be that he's stretched his cheeks out, the cheeks of his face that is, by doing just that, by cramming his mouth full of things as part of his act. His mouth was very large. He had hardly any lips. He had all his teeth, but the molars were much worn away, and the colour of their enamel streaked like marble. The space between the jaws, when they were fully separated, measured about 4 inches. In this state, with the head inclined backwards, the mouth and esophagus formed a rectilinear canal into which a cylinder of a foot in circumference could be introduced without touching the palate. So I had to actually measure this out to be sure I was picturing this right. And yet, so according to this, the upper part of Tarrare's gullet was roughly the width of a pint glass. When you tilted his head back, you could see down this gaping pipe right down into his stomach. Again, is that a direct symptom of his condition or a secondary effect of the extremities he's put himself through? Like, has he literally forcibly expanded his own throat by forcing down corks and whole apples and live eels? Doesn't bear thinking about almost. But Tarrare was constantly covered with sweat, and from his body, always burning hot, a vapour arose, sensible to the sight and still more so to the smell. So the stench of gases that arose from him, which we touched upon already, was so dense that it could, on close inspection, be seen emanating from his skin like a kind of haze or steam. He was literally steaming with the smell.
Oh, man.
Which can only support this idea that there's something about Tarrare's metabolism that was just blazing through calories so much faster than a normal person's and turning some of that excess energy into heat, which his body then radiates and is like constantly forced to produce sweat to cool him. Perhaps there's also like maybe an excess of cellular waste products being produced from all this metabolic activity and it's leaching out in his sweat maybe.
They later used him to power all of Paris.
Green energy. Speaking of waste products,
Oh no.
we've come at last to the burning question on everyone's lips.
Oh no.
Hopefully not literally on your lips, but what happened to all his food and not food at the end of its gastrointestinal journey? Did he just have some portal in his guts that transported all this waste safely to another dimension? Unfortunately for his doctors, he did not. He was subject to a flux of the bowels, and his dejections were fetid beyond all conception.
No, no. No, thank you. He's the type of guy, he ends up at your house somehow and it's like, do you mind if I use the toilet? And
Oh, God.
deep down, you're just wanting to say, oh God, no, please no. But being polite, you're just like, oh yeah, sure, of course, no problem.
You need to buy a new toilet.
Buy a new house.
If the archaic language of his dejections were fetid beyond all conception has passed you by, let me put that for you in the form of a playground rhyme. Sticks to your bum like pedigree chum, runs down your leg like soft-boiled egg, diarrhea. The worst diarrhea you've ever encountered. The kind of diarrhea that could kill a farmer.
Poor guy.
And lots of it.
All day, just all day.
All the time.
Oh, poor Tarrare.
I mean, he obviously stepped off the toilet sometimes.
Yeah.
But I think look, I don't really think this was ever in doubt, was it, if you really think about it? It was only really going to end one way.
Yeah.
Tarrare is not the kind of person who leaves nice, friendly, neat little turds.
No.
It was never really on the cards. When he had not eaten copiously within a short time, the skin of his belly would wrap almost around his body. When he was well satiated with food, the vapour from his body increased. His cheeks and his eyes became of a vivid red. A brutal somnolence and a sort of hebitude came over him while he digested. A food coma, in other words.
Yeah. Listen, I get that. I get that when I have a Tunnocks tea cake. If I have a bite to eat in the afternoon, that's me. Good night.
The young Tarrare was almost devoid of force or ideas. When he had eaten to a moderate extent and his hunger only appeased, he was quick and active. He was heavy and sleepy only when he had eaten to excess. Part of that there is something that's vaguely alluded to a few times in the various sources, and it raises a question regarding Tarrare's temperament and intellect. Tarrare is devoid of force and ideas. Tarrare is slow. Tarrare is not of a ferocious spirit. We keep hearing these statements. I can't help but wonder if Tarrare might have had some kind of learning difficulty on top of everything else, which might have exacerbated some of his behaviours. I don't think understanding intellectual disabilities was a particular focus at the time.
No. But then his condition is so unique that, you do think about, just using as an example, with me losing the weight that I have, if I do decide to have a treat and eat something that's sweet, my body's reacting to that now completely differently than it did a few months ago.
Yeah.
Like a few months ago, if I had something that was sugary, I've no doubt that I was at least pre-diabetic, if not actually slipping into diabetes. And so, like, if I ate something that was sugary, like, I wouldn't feel very well afterwards. Like maybe about half an hour afterwards, I'd just feel sluggish. And so you wonder if there's something about how his body's digesting food, where it's affecting the way his brain operates.
Yeah, that's
a type of temporary encephalopathy, or something like that.
Yeah, that's possible. Obviously, what you eat does affect, and as you say, like the whole food coma thing. When you eat loads, even if you take sugar out of the question, you just eat a really heavy meal. You quite often feel sleepy afterwards. Yeah,
and there are people with epilepsy, and some forms of epilepsy can be controlled really well with like a ketogenic diet. It really alters how the inflammation in the brain and things like that.
But on the other hand, if this is something that, even if it is linked to the amount of food he's having to take in, and that's something he is obligated to do, and it's something that he has had to do every single day of his life from a young age, at what point does "I'm just tired and I can't think straight because I've eaten too much" become a learning difficulty? Because if that's something that's been with him every single day of his life, what, chicken and the egg kind of thing, enough. I don't know how you would separate those two things, You
wouldn't. He'd eat both the chicken and the
egg. So I think it's quite possible he was affected by some kind of what we would now consider a developmental issue, whether that is along with or arises from his eating or arises from the same thing, whatever the underlying issue behind his eating, I don't know, but I think it's possible. Maybe a professional could have a look at the primary sources and have a crack at working out what it might have been, but I wouldn't like to, speculate too much. Separately, there's the question of mental health. Tarrare was pronounced sane by the hospital, but it's hard to imagine someone who does some of the things he does not having some kind of mental health issues, either as a cause or result of the stuff he's forced to do. Psychology barely existed as a discipline at the time, so I certainly wouldn't read too much into that verdict of sanity. I'm pretty sure back then sanity would more or less have just been a binary comparison with quote-unquote lunacy, because he could hold a conversation, he wasn't trying to kill people or having visions or wildly raving, then he would likely pass as sane as far as a doctor was concerned. There'd be no further consideration of his mental health. More subtle and hidden problems like eating disorders, PTSD, mood disorders, compulsive disorders weren't really well understood at all. Obviously, I think Tarrare had some physical, medical characteristic that contributed to his eating behaviour, perhaps even obligated him to engage in the behaviour or starve. But I would also expect that the trauma of living with those terrible physical symptoms and being abandoned by his family and sleeping rough and the horrible things he's had to do to get the amounts of food he needed, being exploited by criminals, encouraged to do more and more extreme acts to gain approval, I would expect all that to have had some kind of impact on his mental state. He didn't have a typical or healthy life, so he's at high risk of not having a healthy mental state. Then you have the things he does to animals. There's something beyond just the physical demands of his body there. If he did have intellectual difficulties, and also given the attitudes of the time, he might not have really thought of them as sentient beings. He might not have been intentionally sadistic. If he can't understand there's real suffering involved, it's not really sadism. But either way, there's an element of pathological exhibitionism in that. Especially when he's continuing to do it after giving up his life as a street performer, as we'll see in a minute.
Yeah.
Even if he genuinely just views cats and dogs as food items, the way a butcher views a pig, to take what you were talking about before, he doesn't need to eat them alive. There's no benefit to him in doing so. In fact, it's riskier. I don't know how he didn't have his eyes clawed out, but it's like one of his go-to ways for engaging socially, to put on a gross out show, like a more extreme version of that weird kid at school who eats worms and stuff for attention.
Yeah.
How could he not be profoundly affected in lots of different ways by that life? I mean, we laugh at some of the things he gets up to because it's so out there, but in all seriousness, on top of whatever physical issue he had, on top of whatever intellectual issues he might have had, I think he was probably also a deeply, deeply troubled man. So Curville and Percy's experiments likely didn't help much on that front. They continued and generally seemed to follow the template of the labourer's banquet, testing his limits basically. What gross shit can we get him to do? What can we get him to cram down his massive cavernous gullet? If anything, they got more extreme and gruesome as they went on. If you don't want to hear about an incident of animal cruelty in slightly more detail, skip forward maybe 3 minutes. The experiments eventually became almost just a repetition of his street show. During one quote-unquote experiment, Tarrare was handed a live cat to see how he would react. It's almost too horrible to say out loud, but this is your last chance to skip forward, by the way. As recorded by the doctors, Tarrare immediately killed the poor thing by biting into its abdomen and disemboweling it with its teeth.
Oh, man.
He wolfed down its innards, drank its blood, and stripped and consumed every scrap of the animal with the exception of its bare skeleton. All within a matter of minutes. Half an hour later, Tarrare then regurgitated its fur and skin, like an owl coughing up a pellet. He would go on to perform similar feats involving birds, lizards, snakes, and puppies, to the fascination of Doctors Percy and Curville. Yeah, but I haven't yet come to the most dramatic event in Tarrare's life. At this point, he's been in hospital for several months, and the army decides it wants him back. Christ knows why. This guy made Phil Silvers look like John Rambo, but there's a war on, they need all the bodies they can get, even if all they're good for is being a meat shield. Probably not the best choice of wording, thinking about it now.
He'd love a meat shield.
He'd have that eaten.
He'd be all in about a meat shield.
But Percy and Curville don't want to give up their guinea pig. And I think Tarrare himself doesn't particularly want to go back to his regiment. He's being close to adequately fed for the first time in a while, and there's a distinct lack of hot lead at the hospital. So the doctors come up with a solution that could serve both to make Tarrare useful to the armed forces, far more useful than he was ever likely to be as a frontline soldier, and at least partly retain their access to him for further study. A solution that would put to use Tarrare's unique set of skills. Dr. Kerville contacted General Alexandre Francois-Marie Viscount of Beauharnais with the suggestion that the French Revolutionary Army used Tarrare as a spy. The name's Tarrare, medium Tarrare. Yeah, it's terrible. Having noticed his ability to swallow
I just got it. Medium Tarrare.
Too late.
Sorry, everyone. Sorry.
Too late.
Right, okay.
I actually think I can't take full credit. I think I read that somewhere in like an article or something. And
I'm sitting here thinking, why is his first name Medium?
So, having noticed his ability to swallow and then excrete large non-food items, it was suggested he could be used as an undercover courier to carry secret documents and messages and objects across borders without detection in his guts. The glamorous female double agent, Mr. Tarrare, I believe you have a message for me. Aye, here you go. To test this idea out, a trial message was sealed in a wooden box, which Tarrare was then ordered to swallow, which he promptly did. A day or two later, the box rocketed out the other end. I can only hope they sanded the corners down first, and the message inside was recovered in a readable condition. So, Tarrare became a pet project of General Beauharnais. He ordered him to report before an assembly of military commanders. Given the forces in question and given the time period, it's entirely possible that a pre-fame Napoleon Bonaparte might have been among the leaders at this meeting.
Wow.
At the assembly, Tarrare was officially offered employment as, or more likely, ordered to become, a spy of the Army of the Rhine. And then Tarrare was given his first mission. A French colonel had been captured by Prussian forces and imprisoned at Neustadt an der Weinstrasse, a town behind enemy lines, and Tarrare was required to slip undetected into enemy territory, carrying within himself a large tranche of urgent military correspondence. Sorry, I have to drop off some urgent military correspondence. And then he was to deliver these documents to the prisoner. He was then to return with any information the prisoner may have had about Prussian troop movements. And, no one's going to suspect the sickly peasant of being a spy, right? So Tarrare once again downed the wooden box, and to thank him for his service, the Army of the Rhine presented him with a wheelbarrow of raw liver and bull's lungs, which he then devoured ravenously in front of the assembled generals. Tarrare crossed the border under cover of night. To allay suspicion, he was dressed as a German peasant. The problem is, Tarrare doesn't speak a word of German, and it almost goes without saying that it wasn't long before this suspicious, pungent, French-speaking oddball in German hosen started drawing attention to himself. Before he could make it to Neustadt, some watchful locals noticed Tarrare and alerted a Prussian army patrol, who then caught up to him and arrested him near the city of Landau. He was imprisoned, searched, and interrogated. Of course, nothing was found on him, and to give Tarrare his due, he held his silence about the secret message, even when dragged in front of General Zoegli of the Prussian army and horsewhipped, he kept his mouth shut. So they threw him in a cell to stew. You might think, thank God for that, respite, not being tortured anymore. I'm not too sure about that. I think now comes Tarrare's ultimate challenge. He could handle your interrogation, he could handle your threats, he could handle your torture. He can handle all that and not breathe a word. But this is a man who, over a day ago now, ate a wooden box and a wheelbarrow of raw bull's lungs. A man who suffers from chronic diarrhea. And that wants out. But as soon as he were to give in to the call of nature, obviously the game would be up. In Scotland, we have a rather unpleasant phrase when you think about it. Bursting for the toilet.
Yeah. Busting for a shite is what some people will say.
I think Tarrare must have been almost literally bursting for a shite. He manages to retain the wooden box and everything else he's eaten for 30 hours, Michael.
Oh, no.
Before he finally gives up the truth. He calls for General Zwingli. He admits that he's carrying a load of vital French intelligence documents in his large intestine. And then he's marched to a bog house. He's chained to a latrine. And at last he delivered the documents. Delivered in both the postal and obstetrics senses of the word. In some of the more lurid accounts, it's also said that Tarrare attempted to reconsume the box when it emerged. That's what I call patriotism, mate. But any attempts Tarrare made to foil the Prussians were doomed. General Zwingli and his men had the documents they were after. They triumphantly opened the box to find a note from General Beauharnais explaining that this was a trial run to test the feasibility of Tarrare as a courier and no real intelligence was being sent. So there the Austrian general stands, choking in the smell of yesterday's rotten bull's lung buffet and handling a poop box crapped out by an ex-sideshow performer with nothing to show for it. To say he was pissed off would be an understatement. They dragged Tarrare to the gallows, put a bag over his head, a rope around his neck, and told him to make his peace with God.
He ate that piece.
It seemed like the end of the Tarrare saga until finally the bag was ripped from his head, revealing General Zwingli and his men laughing and jeering at him. They'd put him through a mock execution.
Oh, man.
Something commonly done at the time to break the spirit of enemy agents.
Dickheads.
They took him down, they beat him to within an inch of his life, and dumped him back at the French border. Imagine the whole time Tarrare was just like, doesn't matter, 30 hours holding in a wheelbarrow of rotten meat and finally have been to the toilet.
Yeah, just the relief.
So Tarrare returned to the hospital with Professor Percy and Dr. Courville. He was, as you might expect, profoundly affected by his brief stint in the world of espionage, and he had absolutely no desire to return to that kind of work, or for that matter, the army. And I don't think the military really wanted him back by then either.
No.
At this point, Tarrare decided he would do absolutely anything to be cured of his gluttony. Not an easy task. Clearly there's a complex range of things at play here. There's anatomical, metabolic, psychological issues all sort of interplaying to make Tarrare what he is. But they tried, first by a course of laudanum tinctures, which essentially a mixture of opium and alcohol administered via the mouth. Laudanum is used even today as a treatment for bouts of acute life-threatening diarrhea, so the thinking seems to have been perhaps if the chronic diarrhea was actually the driver for his gluttony.
Right.
If he's voiding nutrients so fast, he needs to continually eat and drink to sort of keep up. If that was the cause of the whole cycle, maybe this would slow things down at the back end and allow him to have a normal diet.
I'm not buying that leads people to eating cats.
No, but I guess it all depends on how you respond to it and what the rest of your life is like. You know, it was worth a try. But no, you're right, it didn't help. Then they tried a mixture of sour wine and tobacco pills. The wine presumably intended as like a digestive to help him with breaking down his food. The tobacco pills, obviously, as anyone trying to give up smoking will tell you, nicotine has an appetite suppressing effect.
Yeah.
I'm guessing that was the reasoning behind that, but it didn't even touch the sides of Tarrare's endless hunger. They even tried soft-boiled eggs as a cure, which is kind of weird. Percy read a case study in which huge amounts of Levantine soft-boiled eggs, which I think probably refers to the dish shakshuka, which is a kind of North African stew with poached eggs instead of meat. Consumed in large quantities, supposedly could be used to curb the appetite. They packed Tarrare up to the eyeballs with eggs and still found him in the back streets fighting stray dogs over dead rats. They also found him creeping around the wards looking for patients undergoing venesection, bloodletting. He would steal and then drink the blood. He was also, on a number of occasions, discovered by staff eating his fill in the hospital mortuary.
Oh, man.
Really is astonishing.
Do you think Bram Stoker based Renfield on him?
I wonder, actually,
There are some really striking parallels.
that's a good point. He's almost escalating like a serial killer. Not saying he's a serial killer, but he's going through a sort of escalation. Is that just he's just getting more and more desperate and they're withholding food from him? I don't know. Is it that he's been further mentally damaged by his experience in the Secret Service? Having said that, I think if someone held a gun to my head and told me I had to take a bite out of a corpse or a bite out of a live cat, I think I'd probably have to pick the corpse, as repellent as that would be. At least it's dead, it's not going to cause it any direct suffering. But it does serve to drive home the fact that Tarrare, at this point, for all Curville and Percy's attempts to explore his limits, it almost seems like he has no limits. Whatever they can dream up to test him with, he'll happily exceed those extremes just of his own volition, without any prompting. He seems to eat pretty much anything that won't immediately kill him.
It sounds almost like he's got this initial problem,
Yeah.
and then once he's in the sideshow,
Yeah.
and he's being treated in a certain way and forced to devour or encouraged to devour all these other foods and non-foods, that he's then kind of, maybe he felt a level of acceptance when he did that. Maybe
Absolutely,
that was
yeah.
in some ways the happiest.
That's what grooming is, essentially, isn't it?
Yeah. They manipulate you that way. And so he's obviously, maybe that's what's happened. He loved the attention that he was getting and he was made to feel good about himself. And then once that's all gone, he's still committing the act.
Yeah. I think that's spot on. I think
because there's some aspect of it.
That stuff didn't not have an effect. That must be playing into it. He was clearly doing this before. Mm-hmm. He was doing some things before, but he was obviously being encouraged to push himself and go further and further and further. You could argue that what was happening on the streets where he is being exploited to make money, it was a form of abuse, was a form of trafficking, possibly.
Yeah.
The other doctors of the hospital by this time had about enough of Curville and Percy's little guinea pig. He'd become like this annoying, demented familiar, skulking about the wards, stealing stuff, eating stuff, stinking the place out, just generally causing chaos and disruption. Several of Curville and Percy's colleagues, no doubt further convinced by Tarrare's escalation to consuming human flesh, had decided enough was enough and they wanted him gone, preferably to a lunatic asylum as such places were then known. But Curville and Percy seem to have bonded with their pet Tarrare. In any case, they wanted to continue experiments on him. There were research papers to be squeezed out of this guy, right? So they tried to keep him under control, but Tarrare was wily. He wasn't going to win at eggheads, but he was fly when it came to getting out from under restrictions, when it came to getting what he wanted. So for a while, Tarrare seems to have been a bone of contention at the hospital. But for a while, Curville and Percy seem to have had it their way. It goes without saying that that would not happen today. It seems pretty obvious that safeguarding and health and safety and gross workplace misconduct were not yet concepts backed up with the power of law in late 18th century France. If you're head honcho at a military hospital, it seems like you can almost do whatever you want. Or rather, up to a point you could. Because something happened that took the matter and Tarrare out of their hands. Sometime in 1794, a 14-month-old toddler went missing from its bed. To this day, it is unknown whether Tarrare had anything to do with the disappearance of the child. Information is very scant. I'm not even able to determine whether this was a boy or a girl or why they were in a military hospital. Children do go missing from hospitals, perhaps then much more so than today, in those days of obviously very lax security, no police forensics to speak of, poor diagnostics for mental health issues, comparatively limited awareness of things like child predators, all of which, in a modern investigation, would have combined to cast a much wider net of possible suspects than just Tarrare. But every source I found agrees that Tarrare, and his often ghoulish and macabre appetite, immediately came under some very dark suspicions indeed. What happened next is another one of those situations where the past just makes very little sense to a 21st century sensibility. There is no arrest, there is no real investigation. What happens instead is a group of doctors and porters, presumably not including Courville and Percy, form an angry mob and chase Tarrare out of the hospital. He's run off, and he doesn't come back. He disappears into the blood and thunder of a country in the throes of a violent revolution. And that was the last Professor Percy saw of Tarrare, for a while. Tarrare resurfaced 4 years later in a hospital in Versailles, and came to the attention of a Monsieur Tessier, the chief surgeon of that hospital. In his exile, Tarrare had returned to an itinerant life of thievery, begging, hustling, swindling, and scavenging. It can't have been a good life or an easy life, especially not in that moment of history, but he does seem to have kept himself fed sufficiently to survive and to remain healthy enough to function. Until, that is, shortly before his admission to Monsieur Tessier's care. Something was happening to Tarrare. Something bad. His previously boundless appetite was gone, but not in the manner of a cure. He now appeared to be wasting away. He was so weak he could barely lift his own head. Some sources, including both Jan Bondeson's book and the Wikipedia article on the subject, state that Tarrare was suffering from tuberculosis, but there's a bit of confusion on this. Other sources, including all of the earlier ones I looked at, such as Curiosities of Medical Experience by J.G. Millingen, which dates from 1839, as well as Anomalies and Curiosities of Medicine by George M. Gould and Walter Pyle, don't explicitly talk about TB. Unfortunately, I've not been able to find the full text of the original contemporaneous Memoir of a Polyphage article by Dr. Percy to confirm whether it was mentioned there. If I'd had more time, I might have been able to track down a copy. But anyway, and I preface this by saying take it with a pinch of salt because I am not a doctor. But the specific symptoms he appeared to be suffering from, the details described in all the accounts, predominantly centre around his gastrointestinal system and the passing of large amounts of pus. I think it's possible that a confusion might have arisen from the following statement in the London Medical and Physical Journal article I mentioned previously, which included a line about Tarrare suffering in, quote, a state of consumption worn out by a purulent and fetid diarrhea, which announced a general suppuration of the viscera of the abdominal cavity. Now, consumption, of course, was used as a term for tuberculosis, but it could also be used more generally for any wasting illness. Dr. William Shield Jr. on MedicineNet gives the definition of consumption as follows: an old and once common term for wasting away of the body, particularly from pulmonary tuberculosis, particularly but not exclusively. And the fact that the Medical and Physical Journal qualifies it by talking about these other non-TB-like symptoms suggests to me this probably wasn't TB, or at most it was TB plus something else. Perhaps that seems like a minor point, but I've come across a fair bit of confusion about it while looking into this. I kind of wanted to give my tuppence on what I gleaned from comparing different sources. I could be barking up the wrong tree though, I don't know. It also just seems like so much more fitting that Tarrare would come down with something so much more gruesome and mysterious than a commonplace 18th century illness like tuberculosis. Look, all these normies with their TB.
Yeah.
I'm not dying with anything less than an unexplained pus eruption from the anus. Tarrare was dying. Sharp change of tone now. And around this time, Professor Pierre-François Percy over in Sault-Sauron received a letter from Monsieur Tessier telling him that Tarrare was under his care in Versailles in a serious condition and was asking for Percy to visit him. Percy, of course, made the journey to Versailles to see his old patient, and the bedridden man was barely recognisable as the unstoppable Glutton he'd known just a few short years before. Tarrare told Percy that 2 years after being run out of the military hospital in Sault-Sauron, and 2 years before being hospitalised in Versailles, he had stolen a golden fork by swallowing it. This seems to have been like yet another feat Tarrare was capable of, and something he would use in his career as a thief, like pinching valuable objects, secretly swallowing them, and I don't know anything about your missing bracelet, you can search me if you want. He hadn't been able to recover this fork from his poop, and he became convinced it was still lodged inside him somewhere, causing his subsequent health issues.
Right. That'll do it. That'll definitely do it.
It would certainly do it if you or I ate a gold fork. I'm not too sure about Tarrare.
Yeah.
So he'd remembered the famous surgeon from the military hospital, and probably one of the few people in his life who had been genuinely benevolent towards him. And he wondered if perhaps Percy knew of some way, some powerful laxative or emetic that could dislodge the fork that he thought was inside him. Bear in mind that Tarrare is likely to have been in the grip of fever and delirium at this point.
Yeah.
Maybe there was a fork in there somewhere, or maybe this was just something that stuck in his mind, something he attributed his problems to. We don't really know. Either way, there ultimately wasn't much either Professor Percy or Monsieur Tessier could do for him. Less than a month later, Tarrare finally passed away. His short, tragic, often shocking life had come to its end. He was approximately 26 years of age. But even in death, Tarrare still had one or two surprises up his sleeve, or up his something anyway.
He kept eating.
As soon as he was dead, his body began to decay at an alarming rate. He was showing signs of putrefaction much more quickly than any normal body. The doctors of the hospital, of course, were more than experienced in carrying out autopsies, more than familiar with the unpleasant effects of death. But the smell arising from Tarrare's body was so fierce that none of the assigned physicians wanted anything to do with it. If you think about how bad he's supposed to have smelled in life, just imagine what his remains smell like dead and under the spell of some unexplained corruption. Finally, Monsieur Tessier himself stepped up to the odious task. He was curious to discover if there was any truth to the tale of the golden fork, and he was desperate to find out what was going on under the hood of a man who could once eat wheelbarrows of offal before setting off on an espionage mission, and down like metre-long eels and snakes without chewing. And so Tessier gritted his teeth, pinched his nose, and put scalpel to flesh. As described in the London Medical and Physical Journal, Volume 40, the entrails were putrefied, confounded together, and immersed in pus. The liver was excessively large, void of consistence, and in a putrescent state. The gallbladder was of considerable magnitude, the stomach, in a lax state, having ulcerated patches dispersed about it, covered almost the whole of the abdominal region. The stench of the body was so insupportable that Monsieur Tessier, chief surgeon of the hospital, could not carry his investigation to any further extent. He did not find any fork.
Or he kept the fork, guy. It's gold, Martin.
So yeah, I mean, Tarrare, even today, no one is quite sure what his problem was.
He ate too much, man. That's quite clear. He just ate too much.
You cut right to the heart of the issue there, Michael. Well done. But what was it that drove his strange appetite? There's been a few suggestions over the years. Some have suggested that perhaps Tarrare was riddled with intestinal parasites from a young age. Things like tapeworm will, of course, essentially deprive you of a portion of the nutrients in your food. So could that have explained why he was able to eat so much and never put on weight? People with heavy tapeworm infections certainly do often lose weight and struggle to put it back on until the infestation is treated. There's even some evidence that tapeworms were once used or claimed to be used by medical quacks, as a weight loss treatment in the 19th century. Perhaps combined with genetics that made him more predisposed to having stretchier ligaments and tissues, so through overeating to compensate, he causes his stomach and throat to become overstretched and able to contain much larger amounts. Maybe. I'm not completely convinced that worms are the cause here. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if he had all kinds of nasty things living in him due to all the raw meat and live animals and everything else, but I'm not totally sold on that being the original driver of his condition. For one thing, worms could only take so much of your food, and one man can only play host to so many worms. A heavy infestation might make someone emaciated and weak and hungry, but it's not going to drive them to eat wheelbarrows full of offal. It's not going to make them roasting hot and have all these other apparently metabolic symptoms. The behavioural phenomenon pica.
Yeah, I was going to mention that.
Yeah, This is where people compulsively eat non-food objects, essentially, sometimes in large amounts. A famous 20th century example of that behaviour would be another Frenchman, in fact, Monsieur Mange-Tout, a performer who became famous for eating indigestible objects like metal and glass for the entertainment of others. He ate an entire light aircraft over the course of a couple of years, Monsieur Mange-Tout. He was arguably an inheritor of that Tarrare tradition of eating horrible things in front of an audience. Some people with particularly low-functioning autism or autism spectrum disorders display this kind of behaviour. So do some pregnant women, actually. I guess, like maybe having a compulsion to eat clay or chalk or something if there's a certain nutrient their body's crying out for.
It's linked to anemia a lot of the time. And pregnant women will
right.
often develop anemia, and children often develop it. But funnily enough, I was actually writing a script for a YouTuber recently, and I was talking about pica and that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a woman from America who she was like eating her own house, essentially eating drywall and.
Oof, that's an expensive dinner.
You better believe it.
There's no doubt that Tarrare's consumption of like corks and stones and metal forks could be classified as pica, but as you've kind of touched upon, pica is a symptom. It's not an underlying cause in its own right. It doesn't really touch on his general eating practices and the physiological symptoms he experienced. There is a rare condition called Prader-Willi Syndrome caused by a gene deletion on one of the chromosomes, which results in symptoms including behavioural abnormalities, restricted growth, intellectual difficulties, and an unrestricted excessive appetite. People with Prader-Willi Syndrome have a deficiency or an imbalance in the hormones that regulate hunger and satiety, usually causing them to constantly crave huge amounts of food and never or rarely feeling full. Behaviourally, that has some striking similarities with Tarrare, but there's one major thing that I think rules this out, and it's that people with Prader-Willi Syndrome, at least those whose diet isn't strictly controlled, are usually very heavy. They have no increased ability to burn off or expel the calories they consume. They put on sometimes dangerous amounts of weight, which of course Tarrare never did. If anything, Tarrare was underweight. The folks on the That Time When podcast that I had a listen to just before recording this episode highlighted that there's a motivational speaker called Lizzie Velasquez who has a rare congenital disease called marfanoid progeroid lipodystrophy. This condition, so rare that she was actually one of the first cases to ever be identified, prevents her from accumulating body fat or gaining weight. She weighs less than 29 kilograms, but, and here's the interesting thing, she has to eat almost constantly, consuming between 5,000 and 8,000 calories per day. Because she has no fat reserves, no stored energy, she relies entirely on short-term bursts of energy from food. This is reminiscent of Tarrare's ability to eat large amounts while never gaining. I think it's definitely closer than Prader-Willi, but again, I don't think this is a perfect fit either. Velasquez's condition is noticeable in her distinctive facial features, which I'm sorry to say made her the target of bullies in her teenage years, simply because she looked different, and this is what led to her becoming ultimately a successful speaker against bullying. She has a couple of very interesting TED Talks out there, which are well worth checking out, actually.
I think I might have seen one of them.
Yeah, it's quite famous. It's got a few million views on it.
Yeah.
The descriptions of Tarrare, while he does seem to have been quite distinctive himself, his features don't quite seem to match those of people with Marfan progeroid lipodystrophy. What's more, as far as I can make out, Velasquez is not able to feast on a huge banquet and then fall asleep for hours the way he did. By contrast, she has to continually eat small meals to keep her energy up. So, although there's some superficial similarities, there are stark differences in the details. It's almost like you take a bit of Prader-Willi syndrome, like the excessive eating and the never feeling full, and you take a bit of marfanoid progeroid lipodystrophy, the never putting on weight. If you could match them together, you would almost have Tarrare's condition, but neither one of them quite meets all the details. Probably a more likely possibility is that Tarrare was suffering from some kind of very strange presentation of hyperthyroidism, or some abnormality of the thyroid. The thinking behind thyroid is that it's largely responsible for controlling the body's metabolic rate, and among other things, brain development and digestive function. Although the contemporary medical descriptions aren't enough for modern day doctors to really home in on a clear answer, what might be the most compelling thing is the combination of eating while not gaining weight, high temperature, and the weird choking vapours that emitted from his skin. I've already touched on this, but it could suggest something about the way he processes sugars or something, like his cells are making use of that energy from his food, but in a really wasteful way that converts a large amount of it into heat. Then on top of that, maybe, a lot of the food is passing through unused. Another possibility is damaged amygdala or hypothalamus. But yeah, I don't think we'll ever know for sure because of the lack of detail that we have from the notes of the time. It might well be that Tarrare's very particular brand of polyphagy was a completely unique genetic aberration that just hasn't presented itself, or so rarely that it hasn't been scientifically categorized. That's a possibility. There are known congenital disorders that affect one person out of millions. Marfanoid progeroid lipodystrophy, which Lizzie Velasquez has, affects just over one person in a billion. There's been less than 10 people diagnosed with it worldwide in all of history. Tarrare could have had another naturally occurring condition that appears even less than that, one in several billion maybe. It's very possible. It would explain why we don't really see this type of condition today, where we look around at conditions that are present in the world now and can't really match it to any of them, as far as I'm aware. But what it doesn't explain is the fact that in that general part of the world, around that very particular time period, give or take a century or so, but actually within Tarrare's own lifetime and almost parallel with his lifetime as well, there were a number of other similar recorded instances of quote-unquote gluttons with very strong parallels to Tarrare. Bizarrely, around the very same time as Tarrare was having his adventures in espionage, on the other side of the very same war, on the Prussian side, was a man named Charles Domery. Like Tarrare, Domery would eat prodigious amounts of raw meat while maintaining an ordinary weight. Domery eventually defected to the French side, to the very same army as Tarrare, because the rations in the Prussian army were too small for him. He'd heard the French were better fed. In the French army, Domery was given double rations, but again, just like Tarrare, that left him starving. For a year, Domery was stationed at a base near Paris, around which lived a large number of stray cats, and you can see where this is going, Michael.
He looked after them.
Yes, he patted all the cats, and they all grew to love him. No, unfortunately not. According to one Monsieur Picard, no relation, Michael, one of the other soldiers.
Maybe that's where he got the name from, Picard. He's like a Pika. That's
God.
in the family. Got the name.
And then all his hair fell out.
We've solved the case. He ate it. He ate his hair.
Yeah, because he was one of the soldiers that lived with him in the base. Explains everything.
Yeah.
And he's a time traveller.
We've done
and
it.
He travelled into fiction.
We've cracked the case. We've cracked the case.
In 1 year, he devoured 174 cats, brackets, not their skins, dead or alive, and says he had several severe conflicts of interest in the act of destroying them by feeling the effects of their torments on his face and hands. Sometimes he killed them before eating, but when very hungry, he did not wait to perform this humane office. When there weren't enough cats around to satisfy him, he would take to eating grass directly off the ground, sometimes eating up to 2 kilograms of grass in a day. Later, he ended up in the Navy, where one of his comrades had a leg blown off by a cannibal, and just like Tarrare in the morgue, Domery was found eating the severed limb. In a final parallel, that ship was later captured by the British, and the crew were imprisoned at Liverpool, where Domery drew the attention of his captors by eating the prison cat, 20 rats, and all the candles he could get a hold of.
As you do.
Yep. Which led to him becoming an experimental guinea pig to a Dr. Cochrane from the Edinburgh Royal College of Physicians. The parallels are just wild. And it blows my mind that out of all of history, these two peas in a pod existed so close together, with lives so closely mirroring one another, and yet no actual direct connections between them? Was there something in the water? Was there maybe some environmental factor? Was there some kind of maybe a thalidomide-like situation, some medicine or folk remedy that mothers were taking in France and Prussia around that time that sometimes produced children with these abnormalities? Or were they suffering from some disease that medicine is familiar with today, like hyperthyroidism, that nowadays never gets to that advanced stage because treatments are available? We might never know for sure, just like we'll never know, most likely, whether Tarrare did indeed eat a child or not, or what exactly this strange, wasting, pus-producing disease that killed him was. Truly an international man of mystery, you might say. But yeah, Tarrare, what do you make of that, Michael?
It is a fascinating story. It's compelling because it's so unusual. It's really tragic as well. And like you say, we don't know, was this person the victim of of a condition, or did he... The accounts are certainly saying that, he consumed animals live. Did he murder that child in the hospital? So it's, as the accounts of his life progress, he more and more starts to resemble a monster and our sort of mind. I do find, in terms of the explanations, you were talking about that girl that suffers from that disease and she was having to...
Lizzie Velasquez.
Yeah. You were talking about her suffering from an illness and she had to consume, I think you said somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 calories or something like that a day.
Yeah, 5 and 8, yeah.
5 and 8. So that sparked in my mind right away. I love stories of explorers and adventurers and things like that. And you do think about people going to the coldest climates and they have to consume a hell of a lot of calories. They have to consume thousands of calories just to function.
Yeah.
Because of the temperature difference. And it's just when we were talking about Tarrare, sweating and giving off heat, you start to wonder, was this need for calories a direct product of his body's inability to regulate temperature correctly?
Yeah.
And that's why the calories were just getting burnt up.
Yeah, I mean, I think so.
Immediately.
I think so. I mean, whether the temperature is the cause or a symptom.
Yeah.
That's a good point, actually. I never really thought of it that way round. My thinking was more...
He was greedy.
Well, if you think about the thermodynamics of it, that when, a biological or chemical process takes place, heat is produced, and the less efficient the process is, the more heat is produced. So if he was lacking some enzyme or was deficient in either in his cells or in something that regulated the function of his cells, then he was still using the energy, but using it only a part of it, and the rest was just being pumped off as heat that he didn't need, and he was having to sweat to lose the heat. I mean, there's definitely something metabolic wrong with him. Yeah. Definitely.
But it's also what you were saying, when his autopsy, and I know by that point he was sort of putrefying at an alarming rate, but you talked about the liver, and when you do have liver disease, it becomes increasingly difficult to convert calories into muscle and other tissues. And I just wonder, it's you were talking about the idea that this might be, say, a genetic error in his DNA that is just so super rare. Perhaps he's even the only person that's ever had it, you never know, or it's 1 in billions. But I do wonder, maybe it's not that it's actually something that's unknown to science. Maybe it's 2 or 3 things all at once.
Hand in hand, yeah.
That probability-wise, if someone has one of these conditions, they don't tend to have the others. So, you have the appetite, you have maybe a wasting disease, you have perhaps the lack of revulsion, or, you have these elements to it.
Yeah.
Temperature problems. You have all of these things, and you just wonder, is it just that he was so unlucky that he actually had several...
The planets just aligned.
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, that's a point, though. It's a really good point.
I mean, because, look, it's one of these stories. It's a little bit like Elmer McCurdy, although Elmer McCurdy's a much more relatable character, I think, in a lot of ways. Like, as far as we know, Elmer McCurdy didn't really kill anyone.
No.
And Tarrare may have been a child murderer. That's the thing, the lowest of the low. But it's just you can't help the ludicrousness of it. And as well, because it was hundreds of years ago, it's terrible, but there's a level of distance to that where you sort of joke about these things. We have joked about it here, but at the end of the day, whatever it was, whether it was a single condition or whether it was several things all at once, it sounds absolutely nightmarish. It sounds like a curse.
Oh, yeah.
I do actually remember now, because at the start of this episode, we mentioned to each other before we started recording that maybe we discussed this before very slightly at the start of Talking Till Dawn when we were looking at topics. And I like to go in blind to most of the topics. I remember now the conversation that we had, because it was about one of my favourite radio drama series of all time. Was a Canadian one called Nightfall. It's amazing. If you get a chance to watch it, if you love horror, you love suspense, this show was being aired in the really early 80s, I think it was 1980 actually when it aired. It's fantastic. Anyway, this is what I remember us talking about, was that there's an episode where it's based on a short story from, like, I've actually got it up here now on my phone. It's like 1875. It's a short story. The Case of Mr. Lucraft. And it's about a poor guy who has, like, an almost insatiable appetite. He can eat and consume alcohol to really extreme levels. And he's sort of preyed upon by this rich man because he has this ability.
Right.
And the rich man gets him to sign a contract. And it's essentially like almost like a deal with the devil. The rich man, and it's a little bit like a kind of inverted picture of Dorian Gray. But this man, the rich man, can consume. He eats the food. He goes away, drinks the wine. He does all these things and he's really debauched. And the man with the insatiable appetite then he's almost like a kind of heat sink for whatever he's doing.
Right.
And he experiences, he belches when the other guy, when the man who's eating the food should be belching.
Like puts his sins onto him.
He's thrown up because of the amount of food that this person's eating,
Yeah.
But I just wondered, like, I knew of that episode from 1980 and I knew it was based on a short story. So it says here that it was 1875 by James Rice and Sir Walter Besant. Sounds as if he should be French or of that region.
Yeah, probably Besant.
But I think he's English. I think he was a novelist. So I just wonder, though, 1875, you just wonder if they had heard the story of Tarrare.
I wouldn't be surprised, and I think there was in fact like a play about Tarrare at some point. Right. But I don't know if that survives, but there must have been some degree of public knowledge of him. There would have been a slight degree of public knowledge of him when he was alive and doing his thing. He would have been performing on like the Pont Neuf Bridge in Paris with lots and lots of people coming past. He would probably be quite a well-known sight on the streets for a while. And then after the journal article and everything was published about him, he became sort of known worldwide, at least in academic circles. So yeah, quite possibly he did know about it.
You do wonder as well, if it was so sort of well publicised, the people that you mentioned who, there were other people who had similar conditions either at the same time or after Tarrare, and if it wasn't environmentally bound in that area, then you do wonder if it's people just trying to cash in some way.
Could be, could be.
From those stories, or like, you get people who are copycat killers and things like that. And anyway, just an idea. But yeah, fascinating case, really fascinating.
I'm not sure really where I sit ethically with Tarrare, where I come down on him, because do I feel sorry for him? He was dealt a monumentally shitty hand.
Yeah.
Biologically and socially. He came from a great deal of poverty. He had struggles that we can't even conceive of. He was exploited throughout his life, really. At the same time, even setting the child thing aside, because that's uncertain, we don't really know if that happened or not. But he definitely tortured animals, and he stole and he scammed people. How much of the blame for that do we offload on his condition? How much was he driven to those behaviours by the people around him and his circumstances? And the attitudes of the era, especially when it comes to the animals. I haven't quite worked out whether I pity him or despise him. Maybe a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
But does he deserve more of one than the other? You know, I don't know. And obviously, did he kill a child? Maybe, maybe not. You know, the child is in a hospital. It's a military hospital. There are wards there for people with dangerous mental health issues who are probably not being treated as we would expect them to be today. There's all kinds of people seemingly coming and going. Was Tarrare just a scapegoat for that? Was this just a good excuse to get rid of him? Or did he really take his gluttony to the next level? Who knows? Just before we go, I want to quickly say hello to a few of the people who've supported us or reached out to us recently. Caitlin, Peter, Joe, Neil and Damien all sent us very kind and fascinating email correspondence. There's a couple of those that we still need to get back to and reply to. I haven't had a great deal of time to get through that, but I'll try and get to it. On Twitter...
So I was just going to say, you have been really holding the ship together, Martin. Keep really sort of having to do everything while I'm working through some stuff.
No worries.
Helping look after a loved one that's going through a difficult time. So you guys may have noticed that, like, all of the episodes, the last handful of episodes have all been ones that Martin's taken the lead on. He's really been doing everything. So thanks, mate. It's much appreciated.
I'll cash it in one day, mate. Don't you worry. That's no problem. On Twitter, we've had messages, mentions, or very kind retweets from Kathleen Logue, Don Gatto, Nikki DeLeon, Sir Lionheart, Sarah, Christina Barton, Misha, Spring-Heeled Jack, not the man, the official Twitter of the audio drama show, do check that out, and Robert Valentine. Apologies to anyone I missed there, but thank you all so much for your support. It means a massive amount.
Definitely. So, listeners will know that for a while I have my own Patreon, but that's really for like my sort of fiction writing and some of the fiction podcasts that I do. So we are going to launch a Talking Till Dawn Patreon. It's going to be something where you guys can help support the show, but also get some exclusive perks and tidbits and behind the scenes stuff, and maybe even segments of the podcast that we cut out that we don't air.
Yeah, because we do end up, right now, this podcast has run to 2.5 hours, and I try and keep all the episodes under 2 hours. So this will be well and truly under 2 hours by the time it's all edited down. It might be like an hour and 45 or something. So there's a lot of stuff we cut out of the podcast. A lot of it is just ums and ahs and someone going to the toilet or, you know.
Inappropriate jokes.
Yeah. But sometimes tangents that are quite interesting in their own right that maybe get a little bit off topic or we just don't have time for them. So I thought maybe instead of just throwing those in the bin, you might like to hear some of that stuff. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe when lockdown lifts, possibly me and Mike, we could maybe go some trips to some interesting places around Scotland that have mysterious or Fortean kinds of history to them. And we can come up with a load of other shit, I'm sure, that you might be interested in watching.
So I'm going to say that the Patreon address is patreon.com/talking till dawn, because I'm going to bet no one else has got that. If they do, you'll not hear me saying this. It'll be something else. We'll have it up and running by the time this episode goes out. If you have signed up for my personal Patreon, which is patreon.com/Michael Whitehouse, and you just want the Talking Till Dawn stuff, then your best bet is to delete your pledge there and go to the Talking Till Dawn Patreon and do it there. It's going to help pay for hosting, and right now Talking Till Dawn costs money. We're not in it for the money, you know, we love doing this show. Yeah. We've been asked by a couple of people, you know, do you have a Patreon? And so this is us setting one up now, and hopefully we can make it a cool little community. I'd love for us to do, you can do all sorts of things on Patreon, you know, question and answer, live streams. Yeah. And I'm sure Martin and I will come up with a whole bunch of perks for people over there. So go and check it out, patreon.com/Talking Till Dawn.
Awesome. Well, Michael, I think the sun is coming up.
Certainly has. I am famished.
Yeah, I'm going to sleep like Tarrare after a barrel full of lungs.
Oh, God.
Guys, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Good night, everyone.
Ta-ta.